welcome to Dangerous Policy. I'm Crispin,
Charlene.
and today, well, there's been some pretty spectacular developments here in Australia. We have been the victim of a massive nationwide cyber attack. You probably heard about it from a state actor, not mentioning China's name, of course, and it's affected every area of government. Now, I'm here obviously talking about this from a purely personal point of view. I'm no government hat on in this room, but I was personally targeted.
Yeah, I actually don't know too much about it. All I know is that I feel like Australia is pointing fingers to China.
Yeah, I mean that's the most open secret. That's I mean, the Prime Minister was very kind of clear. It said that this was a state-based actor and there wasn't many states with this level of capability, which narrows the field, right? And therefore we can assume it's China. And there has been reports in the media that it was in retaliation for blocking Huawei from the 5G network. I don't know what the merits of that are, but basically they're trying to raise the costs on Australia for not allowing their companies to bid for critical Australian infrastructure. But it was interesting. I was targeted personally. So there's a laptop here in the room that helps manage our audio system. That there was like 1 million attempts to crack my password, and I'm glad that I'm not the only one who forgets it. So that was good. And then my home PC has been impacted as well. Like I can't currently use my keyboard.
That's crazy.
That's all right. I was going to get rid of that keyboard anyway, but I don't know whether it's because they've disconnected the access of my keyboard to the computer, or whether the system itself, because it has various defenses, shut down the access to put in key inputs at all, which I think is probably what happened.
It's like important, Crispin.
No, not at all. No. So I mean, the reasons I was targeted was obvious. So the last year before, my along with many others, my university school records were hacked by a foreign power. Obviously I've got a relevant background of interest, but I don't take those things personally because it's just part of the normal game, I guess, of what they do. But if I make this less about me, the fact that it affected every level of government, all kinds of government agencies, critical infrastructure, industry. Like this was not just me. This was a large scale, nationwide attack on our infrastructure. And one of the reasons why, of course, the Australian government would be very reluctant to name China openly would be because that would be an act of war. And this actually gives us a good opportunity to discuss the nature of cyber conflict as it is today. So there is a weird aspect of cyber conflict, which is that there is no deterrence, right? So if you think of deterrence as a psychological state whereby, you want to go into rob a bank, but you're deterred, and you're usually deterred by two things. One, whether you'll be successful, right? You go in there and then they have all these security shutters that close, and well, you've put in all that effort and risk and gotten zero reward for that effort. So that's called deterrence by denial, right? You know that it's probably not going to work, so you don't do it, right? And then there's deterrence by punishment. Like there's all these security cameras, it's very hard to get away. Cash is increasingly difficult to conceal. So probability that you'll be caught and then sent to a lengthy jail sentence is very, very high. You don't see these roving bandits of bank robbers like you did in the 70s and 80s. So consequently, you're deterred from stealing and from a bank, even if you really wanted to otherwise, right? Yeah. And that's the basic, very basic logic of nuclear deterrence. You go, well, I would, nuke you, but then you would nuke me, and then I would lose because I would, the cost is too great. So I'm deterred by punishment in this instance from conducting a nuclear strike because of the consequences that I'm inviting down on top of me. And then the logic of missile defense, right, intercepting missiles midair, is denial. All right, well, you could try and nuke me, but I will shoot them down midair and then still attack you, right?
Yeah.
So you strengthen deterrence by both denial and punishment, like with the bank robbery. You go in, you may not get the money, you're still going to get arrested for trying. So it creates a very profound effect. Whereas cyber conflict is totally unrestrained, right? Because there's hard to, you can conceal where it comes from, right? So there has to be an investigative process by which they say, well, this is the place that was responsible for this particular attack. And then how do you respond? Well, if it all happened in secret and no one was physically hurt, then the cost of retaliating is often disproportionate, right? Like if Australia had to declare war on China in response to this, right? The obvious question in any decision maker's mind would be, is it worth the cost of doing that to respond to this extraordinary provocation, right? Now, if you were to, attack an Australian city with all kinds of missiles, right? Well, then the reaction from the public would be one of uniform outrage and be like, okay, well, of course, this is whatever the cost, this is the only appropriate response. Whereas like a cyber attack falls well below that known quantity. So it is considered an act of war, a cyber attack, according to the international rules of war as it is today. But it's not. It's deliberately, by almost every country that is either a victim or engages in it, deliberately concealed as a kind of and you can divide cyber aggression into a few categories. There is standard espionage. So the old kind of James Bond thing has all been gutted, right? You have human intelligence assets and stuff around the world, but by and large, signals intelligence has become the main beast, right? All the data communication that flows freely around the world has made this the dominant form of spying by far. Then you've got actual malicious attacks, right? And the Prime Minister did say that this was a malicious attack, where you start disrupting critical infrastructure. You start causing economic damage to another through the deliberate disruption of their services and tools. And then there is the idea that you might actually use cyber tools as a direct weapon, right? So either, you can attack hospital infrastructure and things like that, things that might be essential for people's survival, or you might use it as a tool to disrupt enemy military communications and things like that as part of a broader attack. And then there's, you might attack a particular bit of infrastructure, such as what the Americans and Israelis did to the Iranian nuclear program. So the Iranian nuclear program was genius, right? So they have all these centrifuges that spin super, super fast to try and split different isotopes of uranium. And what was happening was that they were randomly speeding up so fast, just by chance, that they would explode, right, and take out entire cascades. And for a long while there, they were finger pointing and blaming each other because they hadn't done this before, so they assumed that they'd made some errors. But in actual fact, it was the virus that is colloquially known as Stuxnet, but the Americans call it Olympic Games, that was used to infect the network and destroy entire Iranian cascades, right? So this is a number of years old now, but it showed that you could actually use a bit of software as a potentially deadly weapon, right? That you couldn't do any other way. So cyber conflict is massive. It's unrestrained. There's no deterrence on any side. I am sure Australia engages in it. I'm sure, we're not saints here, but we're probably very much doing it as part of a coalition effort, if we are doing it. The consequences is escalating. Now that the Prime Minister's come out and announced it publicly, I think in part it was just because of the scale of it, where businesses across the country would know they're being affected by something. And so it's helpful just to get out and say, no, it's a cyber attack. It's not anyone's fault, except for the culpable party. But also, I think by saying it publicly, it does put it into a different category, right? It says, look, we aren't willing to just sit quietly and deal with this below the line, because historically what would have happened is, they would have done something, then we would have done something, and they would have done something. I think what must have happened is that it's moved from espionage, stealing secrets, that sort of stuff, to direct attack on infrastructure. And that escalation, and this is a speculation, I don't know, but I suspect, that escalation has caused the Australian government to say, look, if you continue down that breath, the retaliation may not just be in kind, right? We may look at a whole range of other things to retaliate against what we see as a serious escalation, right? We need to so part of this would have been a warning to sort of say, look, you can continue down this path, but don't assume that it's all going to be subterfuge forever. It's all going to be like covert. Like, we will start calling it out. And then we do, then the relationship at a national level is going to change dramatically. So the government stopped short of naming China as the party, but it gave every hint to say that it was. The government knows full well that everyone is going to blame China. And so basically we can assume it's China, because if it wasn't China, I think the government would either not mention it at all in public, or they would have taken considerable steps to say, we don't think it's China, right? They say, look, we won't mention who it is, but we don't think it's China. They would actually specifically say that. I'm pretty confident, because they would know that everyone would assume that it was China. So this cyber conflict is escalating rapidly, and we shouldn't underestimate its impact. Let's say if the internet was shut down, that's by no means impossible, right? What if all financial transactions ceased? Like, we're basically becoming a cashless society because of COVID, right? No one has cash. So what if you couldn't use your card?
Oh, goodness. I couldn't do
Right. What if no one could, right? That would destroy the economy instantly, right? So our dependence on these electronic infrastructure, on digital assets, is absolute. And so on the one hand, the capability to attack and conduct, potentially very deadly and destructive strikes using cyber tools is extremely high. And on the flip side, the dependency that we all have on data tools is extremely high. Like, one of the advantages that North Korea has is that they have a lot of good cyber, warfare capabilities, but not a lot of dependency on cyber themselves, right? They're a very kind of, agrarian basic society. And so they don't have those same concerns. So it is a new phase we're in, and we do need to address it more openly. And I think we need to be less cautious about it as we once were. Like, previously, I think everyone was just like, oh, it's just computers. It's not a big deal. Whereas now, I think it is critical that we talk about it in a public way, basically whenever it happens, because this can no longer be seen as its own domain of conflict, like that it's completely restricted, doesn't affect other areas. It is entirely possible that a cyber attack can lead to a shooting war, and there's no reason to think that won't happen. So in order to increase the level of deterrence, people have to know that if such a thing occurs, there will be a public retaliation. And China can't afford to do this right now, mostly because, as I laid out in one of my previous podcasts, there are various interest groups in Australia all competing with different ideas as to what our relationship with China should be like. And as I said, the China hawks, of which I am one, are already in ascendancy, right? So their criticism, they're drawing attention to this kind of situation, is just going to drive the Australian populace more into an anti-China camp and make us more intransigent. So the government has done this not only as a way of signalling to China a potential retaliation, but also to signal to them that, hang on, we're quite willing to harden Australian attitudes towards China. Like that would compromise other Chinese goals. Like China's goal for Australia is to make us so dependent on China and so prosperous and rich that the idea that we would join America in some sort of adventure against China is unthinkable, right? So China's goal is to tease Australia out of America's orbit and into a more Sino-centric world order. Right? That's their long-term strategy. That strategy has fallen over in recent decades or recent years because they're in part because of their aggressive policies in their own region, in part because of COVID, but also just their general hostility to Australia, their unwillingness to be patient, and their hypersensitivity towards any kind of criticism or restriction has led to very, very poor overreactions on their part and driving Australia further into America's arms, much to the delight of the United States. But it also indicates a changing global order whereby, previously during the Cold War, there was like red and blue, right? You had the good guys and the bad guys, and there wasn't really much trade or interaction between them. I think there is a serious move underway in Australia to decouple our economy from China. If we achieved that outcome, there would only be one type of relationship between Australia and the Chinese Communist Party, and that would be of the hostility. If it wasn't for our economic relationship, given where things are today, we would be in a state of confrontation. Right?
What's the point of a cyber attack? Like, what are they trying? Like, not pointing fingers, but like, what is the intention of a cyber attack on between countries?
There are different. So, for example, obviously, in the case of the Stuxnet virus, like I said, it was to attack Iran. It was to achieve a political goal, which was to undermine the Iranian nuclear program. In that case, it was used as a direct weapon. And sometimes it's used as a way of gaining certain types of leverage. So, if you're about to have an important global negotiation, it's useful to know what the other side's secret position is. If you're trying to buy a company, what's their absolute minimum floor, because then you can obviously target that. So espionage is a big factor. And then there is, just trying to, in China's case, because of their mercantilist approach to foreign policy, which is basically, you will deal with us, and if you don't, we'll punish you, right? Or if you do anything we don't like, we're happy to punish you economically. Then in this particular case, I tend to sympathise with the reports that are out there, which is that Australia was the first Western country to say we won't allow Huawei to access our critical infrastructure because we're concerned about the integrity of those systems and as one shrewd American put it in the Five Eyes intelligence arrangement, better than 4 eyes than 6 eyes. And so for national security reasons, we discriminated against a Chinese company. And we that discrimination is like not limited to just China. Like we have all kinds of rules around our national security assets. And by the way, I would say that our bias is more in favor of China than it is for China towards Australia. Like it's not possible for Australians to go and buy a lot of stuff in China. Like they have their own national security rules about things like that. So it's easier for China to invest in Australia, I would say, than Australians to invest in China. But nevertheless, they're very sensitive to this. And so to answer your question, they have a kind of tributary approach to foreign policy, and they have for thousands of years, right? So if a tributary state in their mind, like Australia, in their sphere of influence, does something to upset them, then in their mind, it is within their rights to punish that country. They don't view Australia as, the same as themselves. They see themselves as the center of the world, and Australia is a part of their orbit of interest. Even if it's just on the periphery. They're basically signaling to Australia that if you don't deal with us, we're not going to just sit idly by and not do anything. We will do things to hurt you. And that's just a really, really sad approach to foreign relations and totally out of step with economic norms.
So what's the role of our leaders then? I thought they're meant to negotiate these things and not make it escalate.
Well,
to
I think
attacks.
well, that's the thing. Like, it's not the use of cyber attack. Let's lay out a few assumptions. We're assuming, number one, that the cyber attack is in response to things that Australia has done economically and politically that China doesn't like, right? Yeah. That it's an attack as to punish Australia for things like, calling for an investigation into the origins of COVID, banning Huawei from our critical infrastructure, that sort of thing. It's a different use of a cyber attack than what would be, to the extent that there is any generally accepted rule, generally accepted. That the accepted sort of covert approach is espionage. You're doing spying, right? Because that's what everyone does. Or you're doing it in lieu of something else that would be more serious, right? So, for example, with the Iranian nuclear program, the United States was never going to allow Iran to just build a nuclear bomb, right? So it was the minimum necessary force used to achieve an objective, right? So in that sense, it was used as a weapon, but the least lethal, least destructive of the options available, okay? So in that sense, it was kind of an aggressive act, but to meet a specific military objective. Whereas this is to say, it was in the economic sphere, it was in the political sphere, but now we're going to make it in the military sphere, right? It's to say, in response to an economic decision to block Huawei, and in response to a political decision to call for an investigation into COVID, we're going to militarily attack you, but with a covert tool, right, that we don't expect to escalate into an actual military conflict. And what I think Australia has signaled is like, look, this is a dangerous game. If you want to go that way, we'll go there with you. We'd prefer you didn't, right? Because that is not the approach to using these quite dangerous tools for anything other than a military conflict. Like, it would be totally unthinkable for, let's say, China being unhappy with Australia about, our position on the South China Sea, for example, to, stop all Australian financial transactions. Right, like it would just be like it's that the only space in which you would do that is if you're in a military conflict, right? And the way in which China is attacking Australia, fuck, it's China. The way in which this is happening is totally totally unacceptable in any kind of approach to the use of coercive power of one state against another. They're doing it because they're offended. They're doing it to punish someone. And, tough dickies. Like, it's not, that's foreign policy. That's normal kind of diplomacy. And if you want to, this is me speaking directly to the Chinese government. If you want to have, more power and more influence and more control over things, then be better, right? Don't just throw a tantrum when you don't get your way. Understand what happened and improve your foreign policy, because this is only going to lead to more than an equal and opposite reaction. I have no doubt that Australia, in a cooperation with its partners, are already retaliating against China, and I'm sure China is dealing with problems today. So it's just a very dangerous game. And to be fair to China, and this is me being as generous as I can be, the rules aren't well set, right? Which is a reason why we do need to talk about the role of cyber conflict and cyber aggression in the context of other forms of aggression that we are more familiar with. Here's a simple question: is it, if your computers have been disrupted, is it reasonable to launch a military attack? Like, if let's say your bank shuts down, right? Is it okay to launch missiles in response? Well, I mean, we don't know, right? Like, what would be proportionate? Like, what if you don't have your own cyber, tools to withdraw? Like, if you can't respond in kind and your only retaliation that you have is violence, right? is that not appropriate? Like, I don't know. Okay, but it is. I mean, according, as I said, to the rules that have been laid out, it is an act of war. It is actually an act of formal aggression. But what makes it challenging is the legal standard for providing attribution. Unless the aggressor got up and said it was me, right? It's very hard to launch an attack in response because everyone can see if you fire a missile. Not everyone can see if you wrote some code and hit send.
So would it be appropriate then if my bank was affected that response would they affect their bank? I don't know.
But that's the thing. That assumes equivalent power, right? So the idea originally was that the major powers would have significant cyber capabilities and they would respond in kind, right? So you would spy on me, I would spy on you. You disrupt my bank, I disrupt your bank. And through that, we create a deterrence relationship because you go, I don't want to do that to you because then you'll do it to me, right? And what the Americans believed was that they were more vulnerable to this than others because they're more dependent on data than some others. North Korea being that example I mentioned before, where they can do it to others. It doesn't really matter if anyone does it to them,
So they're not dependent.
They don't care about that, right? So North Korea is in a special space, but as China moves, I mean, there's basically no cash left in China either. Like if their bank, if no one could, pay in Tencent and use WeChat or anything like that, or Weibo or Alibaba, then their economy would just stop, right? So we're all kind of mutually dependent on this. And the idea was that would create a deterrence relationship over time. But because of the discombobulated way in which China is using it, not as an in-kind retaliation, but as a retaliation for other stuff, this is an extension of its broader mercantilist approach. So mercantilism is basically saying, look, if you don't do what we want, we will respond in other ways, right? So for example, and China has been the victim of this, right? Like when the British Empire was unable to get opium bought by the Chinese banned it, right? They sent up steamships to crush the Chinese in order to force that on the population, right? They said, okay, well, you don't have, and I'm a big defender of the British Empire, right? But this is obviously a case where it probably had some ethical questions, where they wanted to sell opium to China because they had a huge trade imbalance with China because they were addicted to tea and the tea all came from China. And so they wanted something that the Chinese would buy.
Yeah.
And when the Chinese refused to buy the opium, the British used military force to open these markets, right? And so China's doing the same thing today. They're saying, well, if you don't, accept our telecommunications infrastructure supplies, then we're going to use force to compel you to accept that. And I mean, it wasn't right when it was done to China in the 19th century, and isn't right for China to do it to Australia now. It's an inappropriate use of coercive power.